Welcome to Real Science, where we look beyond the screen and dive into the real-life theories and scientific inspirations behind some of the most popular movies.
Hi, I'm Mia.
I'm Rhea.
We are two high school students who have a passion in movies and science.
So we created a podcast to generate interest within our generation about science in the real world and the future.
And to gain greater scientific knowledge for ourselves and to share with many others.
This episode's movie is The Stanford Prison Experiment by Kyle Patrick Alvarez, made in 2015. This movie is inspired by one of the most controversial and disturbing psychological experiments in history, the Stanford Prison Experiment, conducted in 1971 by Philip Zimbardo.
We will be discussing about the difference between the movie and the actual experiment, the overall results of the study, what we can learn from the study, the ethics, and whether the study was worth it or not. So let's start off with the difference between the movie and the actual experiment. So in an interview, Zimbardo was at least 90% of the movie was accurate compared to the actual experiment. So in the experiment, the participants, the prisoners, they were treated really harshly, and that's also shown in the movie. So the feelings of the prisoners in the movie was also reflected from the actual experiment.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. But obviously, in the actual experiment, the guards and prisoners were prevented from carrying out any acts of physical violence like they showed in the movie. So I guess maybe that gives the experiment a little bit more credibility, reduces its controversy a little bit. And he does state that, Zimbardo does state that he told the researchers explicitly that no physical harm could be inflicted on the prisoners, but still to make them feel like they were in a prison.
Yeah.
So, that kind of comes from those degrading behaviors, the guards insulting them, things like that. Also, the main difference I think is how the movie ended.
Oh, yeah.
Compared to the experiment.
Because in the actual study, Professor Zimbardo's former graduate student confronted him and said by taking on the role of prison superintendent, he had become indifferent to the suffering of his participants. And then he realized that she was right and announced that he would end the experiment the next day. And then the movie depicts this confrontation, but I feel it's to heighten the drama.
Yeah.
Right. And because we see Professor Zimbardo returns to the experiment, and observes the guards sexually humiliate the prisoners.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that, he immediately ends the study.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
But no actual sexual humiliation happened.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think it was just I think because it's a movie, it needs to be dramatized a little bit. I think it still needs to have a little bit of entertainment value,
Yeah,
although I don't know how entertaining that was.
Yeah.
And obviously it gets quite vulgar with it as well, which, yeah, I think it's just to kind of get that audience reaction to it, and that
so that the audience can empathize with the prisoners and almost feel bad for them.
Yeah, because I feel if they did it in a way where she just confronts him and then he goes and ends the study, I think people wouldn't have really thought it was as bad if there was no physical violence, if there was no sexual humiliation.
Yeah.
I don't think people would have felt as bad, because they would have been oh well, they can still control that behavior.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was to really enforce that point, this is something that we don't control as humans.
Yeah, because I think those vulgar scenes, I really wow, that's so disgusting. I can't believe that actually happened.
Yeah.
And these were just university students, and they were made to do that. So
yeah.
I think that scene really was to heighten that drama.
Yeah.
In a way.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've kind of talked about the methods and sort of everything they did, comparisons. So let's talk more about the results, what came out of it, what were the good points, the bad points.
Yeah, and also the evaluation. Can I say something about the evaluation?
Yeah,
I think in this experiment there was a lot of researcher bias.
Definitely.
In the movie you can see Zimbardo, who was the superintendent in the experiment, he was like influencing the guards after the rebellion, because he was like saying, oh, like, it's your job to keep my prison in order, and like right now there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of order out there.
Yeah.
And he's like, why am I hearing excuses? Like, do not forget, you have all the authority and you're stronger than they are. And also establish some order before it gets out of control. So I feel like when he was saying these to the guards, like, it kind of like motivated them to be more like aggressive towards the prisoners. And obviously, like, this, like, maybe they wouldn't have behaved that way if Zimbardo, who was like the person who was doing the study and like paying them, they wouldn't have done
because I think obviously Zimbardo has that role of authority in it. Also, like, I think at the time there was a lot of discussion about it's your personality type that depicts whether you would do it or not. But if you think about it, the people that had the personality to anyways become cruel and become like guards would be motivated by Zimbardo's words. And then the people that didn't want to do that might have just been pressured to do that, might have just been like, oh, I'm expected to do this. And they're obviously getting paid.
Yeah, that's why. So maybe that's
like,
they have to kind of listen to
exactly. I think for them it was more like, well, I do want the money, so I'm just going to do whatever he says.
And then also, like, in real life, in the actual experiment, like, the research assistant like also tried to influence the behavior of like one of the guards by encouraging him to like participate more and like be more tough for the benefit of the experiment. So this is also like shown in the movie as well, of the researcher bias.
Yeah.
But like, what were the results?
I mean, I think the results were quite well depicted in the film, where prisoners felt like prisoners. They felt isolated. They felt like dehumanized. Yeah, I think, and like you can see that like in like immediately on day one, we saw guards just becoming, violent. They started threatening the prisoners.
Yeah,
and it's like there was, I think, maybe 2 minutes in the movie where it was like the guards were just joking around, the prisoners were just joking around, but it got serious very, very quickly.
Yeah, they were like also like shoved into a closet.
For,
punishment.
Exactly. And there was also like, I think there's a little bit of an ethical issue in there as well, wasn't there? With the person, well, one person died, which was probably not very good for the experiment, but also there was one who he like vehemently requested for a doctor because he was like, I can't do this, like I'm mentally unable to keep up here. And even then, like, Zimbardo was like trying to convince him, like, oh, but do you really need help?
Yeah.
Do you really need to go?
Yeah.
So I think that really like brings into question the ethics, and obviously that's where all this controversy is really rooted from.
Okay, so like I think now this like brings us onto like the ethics of the study. So like, when you were talking about how like when that one of the prisoners went up to Zimbardo like asking to see a doctor, and then Zimbardo was like, do you really need to see the doctor though? I think that's also kind of like, the ethics of like the right to withdrawal. Yeah. Because like in the study, like we see like also I feel like the prisoners, because they conform to their roles like so much, like the prisoners we see, like they felt that they couldn't even like
like they forgot they could leave.
Yeah, they forgot that they could leave, and like they were so like conformed to the role that like they believed they weren't even participants in the experiment. So I feel like they didn't really know if they had the right to
I feel like they just like forgot that they could just leave. Yeah. Which I think, do you reckon because the prisoners were doing the experiment full time and the guards were doing shifts, do you reckon that probably had something to do with it? Yeah, because like it wasn't like they were like on and off. They were like in that role for the whole period of the study. So I think that was... But we never saw the guards ever wanting to withdraw. We
Yeah,
never
'cause
saw.
I think they like that authority.
Yeah. And the ones that didn't like it, I think they just stood quiet and let it happen. Which
Yeah.
again is like human behavior, and it's how we act under authority. Is we forget who we are, we forget what we want to do, we just kind of like do what people around us are doing because someone in power told us to. So yeah. But having said that, and having discussed ethics, there was informed consent given when they did the study. The participants, and that they showed us in the beginning of the film.
They were all given like informed consent like before the experiment.
And actually, Zimbardo did go to the American Psychological Association in 1973, which 1973 probably not the most ethical time for psychological experiments, but still. And the APA did do an ethics evaluation, and they said that everything had been followed, all the guidelines had been followed.
Which just shows like how like the difference between now and like then, like the
yeah,
ethics,
how much
because like
changed.
This study would have
I don't think it wouldn't have slide at all.
Yeah. I think like the mental, you know, impacts, and like also like the physically like the harm, they wouldn't have allowed that today. Because obviously like I feel like the guards did really like torment and abuse those like prisoners, and obviously that's wrong today. You know.
And like even though in the film they did like physical assault and there was none in real life, they really like mentally tortured these people. Like if an experiment, even at this time where ethics were like pretty much zero, for an experiment to end like not even halfway through because of the mental state of the participants, just shows like that was a lot of trauma that they went through, and like there was a lot of torment. And
and also like in the experiment, like some prisoners did like discontinue their participation, but like in general, like the prisoners, like I said, they like seem to forget like or misunderstand that they could like leave the experiment, and this like leave like through established procedures, and like they reinforced like a sense of imprisonment by like telling each other that there was no way out. So
like they were literally telling like, but I think that's again, you know, conformity, and that's the de-individuation we see, and that's the sort of results of what the study could do and what human behavior is, that when put in a role, we're most likely to just follow what they tell us to do instead of, you know, using everything that we are. Which, I mean, obviously we have so many factors that contribute to that and why that happened. And those factors, I think that's what we can learn from the study. I think that's what we're going to talk about. There's a lot of things we can learn from this study.
I think like one like main theme of this study was like de-individuation, right? And like how quickly, like I think the idea is like how quickly people can lose their sense of reality because who they are told that they are, or like the roles that they're supposed to like embody,
and when you implement like power dynamics into it,
so like for like in the context of this study, like the guards, they were given batons, a uniform, and like sunglasses. And sunglasses was to like prevent like eye contact and create anonymity, right? So that shows like the de-individuation, because that's like not who they actually are. They just have like uniform.
I think that's like a mask. Like the sunglasses were almost like you can't see their whole face, and that kind of like allowed them to hide behind whatever they were doing at
like
guards.
With the prisoners as well, they were like stripped naked, and they were also given like
orange like dresses, not even like pants and stuff, like a dress, which like,
and they were also given like a number as well. So
that
they
like
quickly conformed to that role of like a prisoner.
I think all of that, like they were given a dress, they were given numbers, all of that made them basically lose their sense of identity, because, you know, males given a dress to wear, that, you know, that their gender goes out of play, their name is taken away from them. and then like them being stripped naked, like they're sort of like
dehumanized.
Yeah, they're dehumanized and they're made very vulnerable. And I think
kind of like an animal.
Yeah, and when someone is vulnerable, I think, you know, that kind of like your survival instincts will kick in at that time. And I think like your sort of like innate behavior of doing that, because I think the study showed that de-individuation is innate behavior, because I think Zimbardo had said that he wanted to kind of come off like what happened in World War II with the concentration camps and things, and sort of just because at the time in America, communism was a very like taboo thing. Like if you were a communist, you would be caught, you would be put into jail. So like I think for him it was to kind of not side with, but like kind of show that maybe they're not all as bad as we think they are. Obviously what happened in the concentration camps was horrendous, but you know, the soldiers that were there were 18 years old, 19 years old. Did they really know what they were doing? Or were they just put in a military uniform and told to do something by a person in power, and that's what they did? Because that's essentially what this experiment is. They were told to do something by a person in power, given a uniform, and that's what they did. They literally became tormentors. And they were all checked before. They were all, you know, mentally healthy. None of them had like these tendencies to be violent, tendencies to be
considered as like normal.
Yeah, mentally like, normal.
University students.
Exactly.
Who just wanted money.
Mm-hmm, yeah. So, I mean, it does show that, doesn't it?
Oh, so like also this shows like the importance of uniform in real life, right? So like we said about like, you know, in the military, how the soldiers, they're given uniform and that creates like a sense of authority for them. And also like this also links to like uniform in like schools as well. So like when like for example students were given a uniform, right? Yeah. And so that like we kind of embody like a person who like, you know,
has no power,
and like we have to like listen to someone who has power, like the teacher,
like
right?
the teachers,
and also like
I think it's just like, I think it shows that there is sort of like uniform and changing your appearance really affects your sense of identity and really affects who you are, and it shows how important a self-identity is. Because like you can so easily lose it and become someone you never thought you could ever be. So it's like, you know, I think it really showed us that human behavior isn't what we always thought it was. It always isn't, oh, this person has this personality and that's why they're this way. Like, or this person has gone through this trauma or has gone through these situations and that's why they are the way they are. When really, you do never know how you're going to act in a situation until you're put in it. And the way you act in a situation may not be who you are.
Yeah, because like also at the end of the study when they did like
the interviews,
post interviews, like the guards, the participants who were like the guards, they were like, oh, I would have never done that. But like, and then like another participant was like, oh, but you never know because you were like,
exactly.
You know,
even the participants that played the prisoners said like, you know, if we were the guards, we don't think we would have acted any different. Especially like the main guard, like the one that was like the messiah of it all, you know, like the guy that just like he acted like that actor, he deepened his voice and everything. He showed a lot of regret in the post interviews. Like he was
like kind of surprised how he was like behaving in the experiment.
He was
treating like those prisoners.
He literally said like, I don't know what happened to me. So I think
uniform is just really important. Like
and self-identity is really important. And being able to foster that is very, very important.
Yeah. So now let's finally look at whether the study was worth it or not.
Yeah, because that's a big question.
Yeah, because obviously this study was known as to be a very controversial experiment.
Yeah.
And I think one reason why it might have been named as one of the most controversial experiments was because of the impacts on the participants.
Yeah.
Because, again, in the experiment, the prisoners, they were stripped naked, referred to as a number, wore a dress, made to perform sexual humiliation.
Yeah.
Do a lot of push-ups, and this also kind of links to the what they did in the Nazi concentration camps. This was a form of physical punishment.
Yeah.
And they were also deloused with spray to convey the belief that the prisoners were contaminated with lice and germs. They were made to do a lot of counting, and they were literally pushed into a closet for punishment. And so I think this really had a lot of psychological harm on the participants, and maybe they didn't realize this, in 1973, because mental health wasn't really...
It wasn't a thing back then. I mean, psychological research itself was new.
Yeah, it was really new. But despite the suffering, despite suffering extreme emotional stress during the experiment, all the participants regained their baseline emotional states after the study, so that's good. And extensive follow-up testing reviewed no lasting trauma to the participants.
But I think even that can be questioned. I think if you go through something like that, you're never going to forget it.
Yeah.
I
think that would stick with you.
That would stick with you. Also, again, we're talking about the 1970s, where follow-up testing, maybe not the best.
Yeah.
Also, the follow-up testing was only done up to a year, I think it was. We don't know what happened after that. Again, they did interviews. They probably just thought, oh, if I say something bad, something bad's going to happen to me. Yeah. Especially the prisoners, because, they already were in this situation where, they felt they were prisoners. They felt something bad would happen to them if they broke the rules.
Yeah.
Even though they were very well aware that it was an experiment and that they were being paid and they were protected. They had a whole contract. So that could have just continued on that internal thing of I still can't say anything bad. That could have just continued on, and we wouldn't have known. So I think
but it also has this study also helped us to understand human behavior, because Zimbardo also said it was relevant for retraining police officers to be aware of their biases and to reform changes in the correctional system. So I think Zimbardo wanted to do the study to change society. To change the correctional system, and also retrain the police officers to be more aware of their biases towards the prisoners. And Zimbardo was we have 2 million citizens in prison, more than twice as much as any nation in the world, and citizens pay millions of dollars in taxes for a system that doesn't work. I hope it will trigger ideas about what's happening in our prisons or in our schools.
That schools point is so important.
Yeah.
Because we see prisoners and we see guards, and people will look at this experiment and be like, okay, well, but the real people are criminals, so they should be treated that way. Okay, punishment. I think even up to that extent, there's some sort of justification for it. But that school's point, I think, is so important, because it's quite literally, students go to school in uniforms. That's such a big example of power dynamics built in through uniform.
Yeah, in the experiment, uniforms contributed to establishing clear power dynamics between the guards and the prisoners. And similarly, school uniforms help define the structure within a school environment by emphasizing respect for authority and a professional learning atmosphere. And like the presence of uniforms can like remind students of the expectations and rules they need to follow. Right?
Yeah, like all the restrictions that are put on them. Like even with uniforms, we also get put in dress codes. Like you can only wear your hair up a certain way. You can only paint your nails a certain way. Jewelry is specific. Shoes are specific. So it's very controlled. And then, you go to teachers, and they kind of just wear whatever they want.
Yeah, I feel like these teachers, they still have their sense of identity because they can still be allowed to, wear what they want. Whereas students, we need to like conform to the rules of the school.
Yeah.
And,
And I think that's why, like, you can generalize so much to the student body. Like, that's why it's, like, so stereotypical of students all around the world to act the same. Because they're all, put into the same situation of uniforms and no uniforms.
Yeah.
And I think maybe, like, when you look at schools that don't have uniforms in them, there's, like, a difference in behavior.
Yeah.
I think, kids that go to schools that don't have uniform tend to usually be, like, public schools, so there are, like, other factors in them, but, they're more known to be, like, rowdy, or they're known to be, like, they break the rules, and they're, less strict, whereas kids in uniform are, like, rule followers, and they're very reserved, and they're very, like, they listen. I don't know how to explain it, but yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that plays a part in it as well. I mean, obviously others, like socioeconomic factors, that play a part too, but I think that plays a big part in it. Okay, so now I think we should probably comment on whether we think it was worth it or not. I mean, there's two sides to it. On one hand, you've got it probably wasn't worth it because it did a lot of psychological damage to participants. Yeah. Even though there was only 14 of them, that's still 14 people that, it did cost their well-being. It added a lot of emotional distress to them. And even though the experimental procedures, and they had follow-up testing and all of that, at the end of the day, like, you never really know how someone has been psychologically harmed, especially in that time when we didn't know much about mental health at all.
Yeah.
You never know how someone's been psychologically harmed, and how that carries with them, and how that sort of shapes up who they are. Because, like, the guards could have come out of it seeing how they acted, and they might have just changed their whole personality of it so that never happens again. The prisoners might, become more vulnerable as people. Yeah. They might feel more inferior as people because they've been treated like prisoners. They've been treated like criminals. And, I think at the end of the day, something like that is probably going to settle into you and rear its head later on in your life. Also, the experiment itself probably wasn't the most objective, the most scientific experiment out there.
Because there was I feel like a lot of researcher bias.
Yeah, a lot of researcher bias. There's a lot of, like, lack of control. We didn't really have anything to compare it with. Yeah. The role assignment itself, I mean, they did interviews to judge characters, but at the end of the day, they didn't really randomly select them. We saw that at the beginning of the movie as well. They were interviewed, and then they were kind of sorted into piles, even though they all were supposed to have similar states of mental health, similar personalities. There was no lack of, like, there was just no random selection. It was just, there was some sort of bias introduced there. Also, Zimbardo himself got involved in the study, which, I don't know.
Probably, again, the researcher bias.
The researcher bias, and then the fact that he also tried to manipulate the study by, obviously probably to prove his own theory.
Yeah.
But, yeah, he tried to manipulate the theory, manipulate the results. So I think, obviously, there there might be some exaggeration in behaviors, exaggeration in the results, which might not, you know, be very scientific. Also, it was artificial. It was in a basement of a university. People were being paid to be there. Um, it Can we really apply that to real world situations? Maybe not to a high extent. Yeah, you could in little bits because it does show a lot. But at the end of the day, like, it was, in real life, those situations are always so explicit and so clear. And so you can't always just coin it to, oh, and then humans conform. Because there are situations where people are who genuinely do act like that and who do need to be held accountable for their actions. So, I mean, there is an argument that it wasn't worth it because I think that's something we would eventually understand, or I think it's research that might need to be repeated in a more ethical way, in a more ethical, more objective way, where it doesn't cause that much harm, or that behavior needs to be shown in maybe a positive way. So instead of showing that humans can be really bad, we can try and show the same thing by humans being really good. You know?
And of course, like, there's arguments in favor for whether the study was worth it. And I think one of the main arguments is that, like, the study did reveal the power of situations. And I feel like the study highlighted how, like, situational forces and, like, uniform can lead, like, ordinary people to commit, like, harmful acts, like, as shown, like, with the guards. And, like, shows the influence of authority, power, and, like, group dynamics. And also for the guards, like, they showed the Lucifer effect, and that, like, which is, like, a term coined by Zimbardo himself following after the experiment, and it refers to, like, how ordinary people can be led to commit immoral actions due to situational and social factors and pressures. And this effect, like, emphasizes the power of situations and uniform in shaping behavior, and this, like, often overrides, like, personal morals and ethics, because these, like, the guards, they were, like, the participants, they were, like, normal. They had, like, normal mental health, and they did, like, checks to see if they had any, like, issues, but they were all normal. And then when they were conforming to the role of the prison guard, they started becoming, evil and act in such, like, ways,
Yeah, and I think that's kind of like, where the term, like the phrase, you don't know how you're going to act unless you're put in that situation. I think that's basically what this study describes.
And of course, like, this helps us to understand human behavior, right? And how, like, good people can do bad things when placed in certain circumstances, such as in prisons, military settings, or schools. And also, like, de-individuation was a factor leading to this unethical behavior, as seen in, like, the Lucifer effect. And so I think, understanding human behavior, like, at that time, they didn't know that much of it.
I think it was definitely important at that time.
Showed how important situational factors and uniform are in real life.
And I think there was also, like, a lot of political beliefs at that time, and I think people, they were a lot more judgmental of how you can react in a situation, or how people were acted in different situations around the world at that time, that I think this study was important to show that, wait a minute, let's look at the bigger picture and see, what's happened here. Because it was a lot of the times, like, the most innocent people were, like, blamed of doing so much. They were, like, told that they were evil, when was it just like the situation they were put in, the people they were around that made them act that way?
Mm-hmm. And also, I feel like the study also like kind of emphasized like the need to focus on like structural reforms and systems that can like foster like this type of like dehumanization, this like immoral behaviors, like such as like the prison system or like institutionalized like settings.
Yeah, I think overall the movie itself was quite good in terms of like direction and the actors and things. I think they embodied the role and the sort of atmosphere of the movie really, really well.
Yeah.
Obviously, it was accurate, right? Zimbardo said it was, what, 90% accurate. Yeah. So I think it's a good depiction of the film. The film itself it wasn't like boring. It didn't feel like a documentary. It did feel like a proper film.
Yeah.
So
I think it was like really well made.
Yeah, it was.
Like show
exactly, and I think it did a really good job at making us as like an audience empathize and actually see how severe the situation was, because I think it's so hard to show psychological harm and so hard to show like psychological distress in films, because obviously that's something individual, that's something one person feels and it's always in their head. So to be able to show that, even though they had to add elements like sexual humiliation and physical assault, to be able to still show that, I think is really difficult, and I think they did it really, really well.
Yeah. And like also like one final like point, I think like if the study was worth it, like if we were like in Zimbardo's shoe, I think it was worth it.
Yeah.
Because I think that the aim of the experiment was to see like how situations can corrupt individuals.
Yeah.
To show like the Lucifer effect.
To show it.
Right? And like show the power dynamics and like conformity and, you know, the effect of like de-individuation and stuff.
Yeah.
Like the results from the experiment like gave, you know, a clear
understanding of that, and a clear a clear explicit result that can happen. The Lucifer effect is definitely real.
Yeah.
Now, whether it was exaggerated or not, we don't know. Yeah. But I think there's still an element of that to it.
Yeah.
And I think you know, that the study shows that. I don't think we can really say that, oh, the study was definitely not worth it, because it was. It showed us a lot about human behavior.
Yeah. Anyways, hope you learned something new.
Signing off, Mia and Rhea.